The summer heat was unbearable in London as thousands of tourists crowded around Buckingham Palace. Among them was Jake Morrison, a 28-year-old American from Texas who had saved up for 3 years to take this dream vacation to Europe. Jake was not like other tourists who came with respect and wonder. He was loud, obnoxious, and believed that his money gave him the right to do whatever he wanted. Jake had spent the morning taking selfies at every famous spot he could find. He posted dozens of photos on his social media, each one with captions about how everything in London was so much smaller than back home in Texas. His followers ate up his arrogant posts, encouraging his behavior with laughing emojis and comments telling him to show those Brits how Americans do it. As Jake approached the palace gates, he noticed the crowd gathering around the famous red-uniformed guards who stood perfectly still at their posts. These were the Queen's Guard, elite soldiers from various regiments who had served their country with honor and distinction. But Jake saw them as nothing more than tourist attractions, like living statues put there for his entertainment. The guard Jake focused on was Guardsman William Chen, a 26-year-old soldier who had served 2 tours in Nimrud, Afghanistan before being selected for this prestigious posting. William had trained for months to achieve the discipline required to stand motionless for hours, regardless of weather conditions or tourist behavior. His black bearskin hat, red tunic, and polished boots represented centuries of military tradition and honor. Jake pulled out his phone and started recording a video for his social media. "Check this out, guys," he said loudly to his camera. "These dudes just stand here like robots. Watch this." He began making faces at the guard, expecting some kind of reaction. When William remained perfectly still, Jake's voice grew louder and more demanding. Other tourists nearby began to feel uncomfortable as Jake's behavior escalated. Parents pulled their children closer, and several people shook their heads in disapproval. An elderly British couple muttered something about typical American tourists, but Jake was too focused on his phone to notice the growing tension around him. "Come on, robot man," Jake taunted, stepping closer to William. "Don't you have any emotions? Don't you want to say something back to me?" The crowd began to thin out as people moved away from the increasingly uncomfortable scene. A few tourists tried to quietly suggest that Jake should stop, but he brushed them off with a wave of his hand. What Jake didn't understand was that these guards were not performers or entertainers. They were active military personnel carrying out their duties with the same seriousness they would bring to any military operation. William had faced enemy fire in combat zones, had lost friends in service to his country, and had earned his position through years of dedicated service and sacrifice. The palace security cameras captured every moment of Jake's behavior, and several plainclothes security officers began moving discreetly into position. They had seen this type of situation before, but something about Jake's aggressive attitude and complete disregard for boundaries set off their internal alarm systems. As Jake continued his performance for his phone camera, he failed to notice the subtle changes happening around him. The other guards had received silent communications about the situation. Palace security was being alerted. Even the local police officers who regularly patrolled the area had been quietly informed about the developing situation. William, meanwhile, remained as still as a statue, his eyes focused straight ahead. His military training had prepared him for much worse than an obnoxious tourist, but years of service had also taught him that situations like this could escalate quickly and unpredictably. He had seen how quickly disrespect could turn into actual threats, and he remained alert despite his motionless appearance. Jake's friends back in Texas were watching his live stream, cheering him on through the comments. They had no idea they were about to witness something that would change their friend's life forever. The stage was set for a confrontation that would teach Jake a lesson about respect, tradition, and the consequences of pushing the wrong person too far. Jake's behavior grew more outrageous by the minute. Not satisfied with just making faces and taunting the guard, he decided to take things to the next level. He moved even closer to Guardsman William Chen, his phone camera capturing every moment for his growing online audience. The live stream had attracted hundreds of viewers, most of whom were encouraging Jake's disrespectful behavior. "I bet I can make this guy move," Jake announced to his camera with a cocky grin. "These British soldiers are probably all weak anyway." His words carried clearly across the courtyard, causing several British tourists to gasp in shock and anger. A middle-aged woman approached Jake and politely asked him to stop, explaining that the guards were serving their country and deserved respect. Jake turned his camera toward the woman and laughed. "Mind your own business, lady. This is content gold right here." He dismissed her with a wave and turned back to William, who continued to stand at perfect attention, his face showing no emotion despite the growing disturbance just feet away from him. What Jake didn't realize was that his harmless fun was being carefully monitored by multiple security systems. The palace had sophisticated protocols for dealing with disruptive visitors, and Jake's behavior had already triggered several warning levels. Plainclothes officers had positioned themselves strategically around the area, ready to intervene if necessary. Detective Inspector Sarah Matthews had been watching the situation develop from the security control room. With 15 years of experience in palace security, she had seen every type of tourist behavior imaginable. But something about Jake's escalating aggression and complete disregard for warnings concerned her. She spoke quietly into her radio, alerting additional units to be ready for deployment. Meanwhile, Jake decided to test the guards' limits even further. He began making loud noises, clapping his hands near William's face, and even started doing an impromptu dance routine just inches away from the soldier. The crowd of tourists had now completely dispersed from the immediate area, leaving Jake essentially alone with the guard and the invisible security presence. "Come on, man," Jake shouted at William. "I know you can hear me. Just say one word, just move one muscle. I'll give you $20 if you just blink." He pulled out his wallet and waved the money in front of William's face, completely oblivious to how insulting his offer was to a professional soldier. William's military training was being put to the ultimate test. He had been taught to ignore distractions, to maintain his post regardless of provocation, and to represent the honor of his regiment and his country. But he had also been trained to assess threats and respond appropriately when situations escalated beyond acceptable boundaries. The breaking point came when Jake made a critical mistake. Frustrated by his inability to get any reaction from William, he decided to physically touch the guard. "Maybe you're not even real," Jake said with a laugh, reaching out to poke William's arm. "Maybe you're just a really good mannequin." The moment Jake's finger made contact with William's uniform, everything changed. What Jake didn't understand was that touching a Queen's Guard while they're on duty is not just disrespectful. It's actually illegal. It's considered assault on a member of Her Majesty's forces, and the guards are authorized to respond with appropriate force to protect themselves and maintain the security of the royal premises. William's response was swift, precise, and completely within his legal authority. In one fluid motion that demonstrated his military training, he stepped forward, bringing his rifle to a ready position, and delivered the famous command that every Queen's Guard is authorized to use. "Stand back from the Queen's Guard." The command was delivered with such authority and volume that it echoed across the entire courtyard. Jake jumped backward, his phone nearly falling from his shocked hands. The sudden transformation of William from a silent statue to an imposing military figure was so dramatic that Jake's mouth fell open in complete surprise. For the first time since arriving in London, Jake was speechless. The cocky grin disappeared from his face as he found himself staring down the barrel of a rifle held by a soldier who clearly meant business. The hundreds of viewers on his live stream were suddenly witnessing something very different from the entertainment they had been expecting. The palace security officers immediately began moving in from their positions, recognizing that the situation had now crossed into criminal territory. Jake's harmless fun had just become a serious legal matter, and he was about to learn that there are consequences for disrespecting those who serve their country with honor and dedication. The courtyard fell silent except for the echo of William's commanding voice. Jake stood frozen, his face pale with shock as he stared at the soldier who had transformed from a silent statue into an imposing military presence. The rifle pointed in his direction made the situation crystal clear. This was no longer a game, and Jake was no longer in control. Detective Inspector Sarah Matthews and her team moved swiftly into action, Within seconds, 3 plainclothes security officers had surrounded Jake, their badges now visible as they identified themselves. "Sir, you need to put your phone down and place your hands where we can see them," Matthews commanded with calm authority. Jake's hands trembled as he slowly lowered his phone, the live stream still recording the dramatic turn of events. His online audience was exploding with comments, but most of them had shifted from encouragement to shock and concern. Many viewers were now asking if this was real or some kind of elaborate prank, unable to believe that someone could be so foolish as to assault a royal guard. "I didn't do anything wrong," Jake stammered, his Texas bravado completely evaporated. "I was just having some fun. I barely touched him." His voice cracked as he spoke, the reality of his situation finally beginning to sink in. The carefree tourist who had been making jokes just minutes earlier was now faced with the serious consequences of his actions. Officer James Powell, a veteran of the Metropolitan Police who specialized in tourist-related incidents, stepped forward to address Jake directly. "Sir, you have just committed assault on a member of Her Majesty's forces while they were performing their official duties. This is a serious criminal offense under British law, and you are now under arrest." The words hit Jake like a physical blow. "Arrest? You can't be serious. I'm an American citizen. I have rights." He looked around desperately, as if expecting someone to step in and explain that this was all a misunderstanding. But the stern faces of the security officers and the continued military bearing of Guardsman William Chen told him otherwise. Matthews began reading Jake his rights under British law, explaining that he had the right to remain silent but that anything he said could be used against him in court. As she spoke, Jake's phone continued recording, capturing his arrest for his online audience to witness. The irony was not lost on the security team. Jake's own desire for social media fame was now documenting his downfall. "Please, sir," Jake pleaded, his voice now high-pitched with panic. "I didn't know. Nobody told me I couldn't touch him. I'm sorry. Can't we just forget this happened?" His desperate attempts to negotiate showed how little he understood about the seriousness of his situation. This wasn't a customer service complaint that could be resolved with an apology. It was a criminal matter. William, meanwhile, had returned to his position but remained alert. His quick and professional response had been exactly what his training had prepared him for, and he felt a sense of satisfaction knowing he had handled the situation appropriately. Years of military service had taught him that respect must be earned and maintained, and that allowing disrespectful behavior to continue only encouraged more of the same. As the security officers prepared to escort Jake away, a crowd of tourists had regathered at a respectful distance to watch the proceedings. Many were taking photos and videos of their own, but their behavior was markedly different from Jake's. They maintained appropriate distance and spoke in hushed, respectful tones, clearly understanding that they were witnessing the consequences of crossing a very serious line. An elderly gentleman who had served in the British Army during his youth approached one of the officers. "Excuse me, Constable," he said quietly. "I just wanted to say that I'm glad you people take these things seriously. That young man's behavior was absolutely disgraceful, and that guard handled it perfectly." Jake overheard the comment and spun around angrily. "Disgraceful? I didn't do anything that bad. You people are crazy if you think standing still makes you some kind of hero." His outburst only served to dig his hole deeper, showing the officers that he still didn't understand or accept responsibility for his actions. Officer Powell made additional notes in his report, documenting Jake's continued disrespectful attitude and lack of remorse. These details would be important later when the case went to court, as they showed a pattern of behavior rather than a simple momentary lapse in judgment. As they prepared to leave the palace grounds, Jake made one final desperate attempt to escape consequences. "Look, I'll delete the video. I'll post an apology. I'll do whatever you want. Just let me go back to my hotel and we'll pretend this never happened." He pulled out his wallet again, the same gesture that had gotten him into trouble in the first place. "I can pay for any damages or whatever." The officers exchanged glances, recognizing the attempted bribery for what it was. Matthews shook her head and added another charge to Jake's growing list of offenses. What had started as disrespectful behavior toward a royal guard was now escalating into multiple criminal charges that would have serious consequences for Jake's future. The police station was nothing like the movies Jake had watched back home. The cold, sterile environment of the custody suite at Belgravia Police Station felt oppressive as he was processed for his crimes. His phone had been confiscated as evidence, cutting off his connection to the outside world and leaving him truly alone for the first time since his arrest. Custody Sergeant Michael Thompson had seen countless tourists pass through these doors over his 20-year career, but Jake's case stood out for all the wrong reasons. As he completed the booking process, Thompson noted Jake's continued arrogance and lack of understanding about the severity of his situation. "Right then, Mr. Morrison," Thompson said in his thick London accent. "You're being charged with assault on a member of Her Majesty's forces, disorderly conduct, and attempting to bribe a police officer. Do you understand the charges against you?" Jake's face went even paler than before. "Bribe? I didn't try to bribe anyone, I just offered to pay for damages. That's what we do in America when there's a problem." His voice carried a desperate edge as he tried to reframe his actions in a more favorable light. "Offering money to police officers in exchange for dropping charges is bribery, sir, regardless of how you phrase it," Thompson explained patiently. "And I'm afraid that's how we do it in America isn't a valid defense under British law." The reality of his situation was finally starting to penetrate Jake's thick layer of entitlement. He was in a foreign country, facing serious criminal charges, with no friends or family to help him. His social media followers couldn't rescue him now, and his Texas swagger meant nothing in a British courtroom. Detective Inspector Matthews entered the interview room, where Jake sat across from a duty solicitor who had been assigned to his case. Margaret Whitfield was an experienced criminal defense lawyer who had handled numerous cases involving tourists who had found themselves on the wrong side of British law. "Mr. Morrison," Whitfield began, "I need you to understand that these charges are quite serious. Assault on a member of the Royal Guard carries a potential sentence of up to 6 months in prison and a substantial fine. Combined with the other charges, you could be looking at a year behind bars." Jake's composure finally cracked completely. "A year in prison? For touching someone's arm? This is insane. You people are completely crazy." Tears began forming in his eyes as the full weight of his situation hit him. "I have a job back home, I have responsibilities, I can't go to prison." Matthews reviewed her notes before beginning the formal interview. "Mr. Morrison, I want to walk through exactly what happened today, step by step. Your behavior was recorded, not only by palace security cameras but also by your own phone and dozens of witnesses. The evidence against you is overwhelming." The interview lasted for 2 hours, during which Jake's story changed multiple times. First, he claimed he barely touched the guard. Then he said it was an accident. Finally, he admitted to deliberately poking the soldier but insisted it was just a harmless joke. Each change in his story only served to make his case worse. "The guard was asking for it," Jake finally blurted out in frustration. "He was just standing there like a statue, not reacting to anything. What did he expect would happen?" This statement revealed the core of Jake's problem. He genuinely believed that the guard's professional discipline somehow justified Jake's disrespectful behavior. Whitfield winced at her client's words, knowing they would be used against him in court. She had seen this pattern before with entitled tourists who couldn't accept responsibility for their actions. They always seemed to believe that their status as visitors exempted them from local laws and customs. Meanwhile, back at Buckingham Palace, Guardsman William Chen had been relieved from his post and was completing his incident report. His commanding officer, Captain Harrison, commended him for his professional handling of the situation. "You did exactly what you were trained to do, Chen," Captain Harrison said. "These incidents are becoming more common, and it's important that we maintain our standards. The guard who shows proper restraint and follows protocol protects not just himself, but the reputation of the entire regiment." William nodded respectfully. "Thank you, sir. I must admit, it was satisfying to see the tourist's attitude change so quickly when he realized there were consequences for his actions." Back at the police station, Jake was informed that he would be held overnight pending his appearance before a magistrate the next morning. The reality of spending a night in a British jail cell finally broke through his last defenses. He sat on the narrow bench in his cell, his head in his hands, wondering how a vacation that was supposed to be the trip of a lifetime had turned into his worst nightmare. His cellmate was a local man who had been arrested for public intoxication, and he found Jake's story both amusing and pathetic. "Mate, you really thought you could mess about with the Queen's Guard and nothing would happen. Even my 10-year-old nephew knows better than that." As night fell, Jake lay on the uncomfortable cell bed, staring at the ceiling and contemplating how he would explain this situation to his family, his employer, and his friends back home. The social media fame he had been seeking had certainly been achieved, but not in the way he had intended. His arrest video had gone viral, but he was now famous for all the wrong reasons. The morning light filtering through the small cell window brought no comfort to Jake as he prepared for his court appearance. He had barely slept, his mind racing with worry about what lay ahead. The breakfast of cold toast and weak tea served by the custody officers reminded him just how far he was from the comfort of his Texas home. At Westminster Magistrates Court, Magistrate Eleanor Pemberton had already reviewed Jake's case file before he was brought before her. With 30 years of experience on the bench, she had seen similar cases of tourist misbehavior, but Jake's attitude and escalating charges painted a picture of someone who showed no real understanding of his wrongdoing. Jake appeared in the dock, wearing the same clothes from the previous day, now wrinkled and disheveled. His solicitor, Margaret Whitfield, had spent the early morning hours trying to prepare a defense strategy, but Jake's own recorded words and behavior made her job nearly impossible. "Mr. Morrison," Magistrate Pemberton began, her voice carrying the weight of judicial authority, "you stand accused of serious charges related to your behavior at Buckingham Palace yesterday. How do you plead to the charge of assault on a member of Her Majesty's forces?" Jake looked desperately at his solicitor, who nodded encouragingly. They had discussed pleading guilty in hopes of receiving a more lenient sentence, but Jake's pride was still struggling with admitting fault. "Not guilty, Your Honor," he said quietly, immediately regretting the decision as he saw the disappointment on Whitfield's face. The prosecution, led by Crown Prosecutor David Hamilton, methodically presented the evidence against Jake. The palace security footage was played in court, showing Jake's escalating behavior in stark detail. His own livestream video was perhaps the most damning evidence as it captured his own words describing his intentions and his complete disrespect for the guard. "As the court can clearly see," Hamilton stated, "the defendant's behavior was deliberate, escalatory, and showed complete disregard for both the law and the dignity of a serving member of our armed forces. This was not a momentary lapse of judgment, but a sustained campaign of harassment that culminated in physical assault." When Jake's recorded voice played through the courtroom speakers, repeating his taunts and boasts about making the guard react, several people in the public gallery shook their heads in disgust. Jake sank lower in his seat, finally beginning to understand how his behavior looked to others. The prosecution called Guardsman William Chen as a witness. William appeared in his dress uniform, his military bearing immediately commanding respect from everyone in the courtroom. His testimony was clear, professional, and devastating to Jake's defense. The defendant's behavior escalated over approximately 15 minutes, William stated calmly. He became increasingly aggressive and showed no response to the obvious discomfort of other tourists around him. "When he made physical contact with my person, I responded according to my training and legal authority." Jake's solicitor attempted to cross-examine William, trying to suggest that the guard could have simply moved away or asked Jake to stop. William's response was measured but firm. "Ma'am, with respect, I am not at my post to engage in conversation with tourists or to move, based on their behavior. I am there to perform my military duties, which include maintaining the security and dignity of the royal premises. Moving or speaking would have been abandoning my post." The magistrate then asked Jake if he wished to give evidence in his own defense. Against his solicitor's advice, Jake insisted on taking the stand. What followed was a disaster for his case. "Your Honor, I really don't think I did anything that serious," Jake began, his Texas accent seeming out of place in the formal British courtroom. "I was just trying to have some fun on my vacation. Nobody got hurt, The guy didn't even move when I touched him. Magistrate Pemberton interrupted him. Mr. Morrison, are you suggesting that because the guard maintained his professional composure, your assault upon him was somehow less serious? Jake's face reddened as he realized his words were making things worse. I mean, no, Your Honor. I just think everyone is making a bigger deal out of this than it needs to be. In America, this would just be a misunderstanding. Mr. Morrison, the magistrate said sternly, you are not in America. You are in Britain, subject to British law, and your behavior toward a British soldier was completely unacceptable. The prosecutor then played Jake's own social media post from earlier in his trip, showing his pattern of disrespectful behavior and arrogant attitudes toward British culture. Comments about everything being smaller than Texas and his followers, encouraging him to show those Brits, painted a picture of someone who came to Britain with a predetermined attitude of superiority. Jake's face burned with embarrassment as his own words were read back to him in the formal setting of the courtroom. The casual arrogance that had seemed funny to his online followers now sounded petty and offensive in front of a British magistrate. When the evidence phase concluded, Magistrate Pemberton called a brief recess to consider her verdict. Jake sat in the dock, finally understanding that his vacation had become a life-changing disaster. The weight of his poor choices pressed down on him like a physical burden. His solicitor leaned over and whispered, Mr. Morrison, it's not too late to change your plea. The magistrate would look more favorably on a guilty plea accompanied by a genuine apology. But Jake's pride, the same pride that had gotten him into this situation, prevented him from admitting fault even when faced with overwhelming evidence of his guilt. He shook his head stubbornly, sealing his fate and ensuring that whatever punishment awaited him would be as severe as the law allowed. When court resumed, Magistrate Pemberton's expression left no doubt about her verdict. The courtroom fell silent as she prepared to deliver judgment on Jake's case. Even Jake, despite his stubborn refusal to change his plea, seemed to sense that his fate was sealed. Mr. Morrison, the magistrate began, her voice carrying the full weight of British judicial authority, having reviewed all the evidence presented to this court, I find you guilty on all charges. Your behavior was not only criminal, but represented a profound disrespect for our institutions, our military personnel, and our nation. The words hit Jake like a physical blow. Despite all the evidence against him, some part of him had still believed that his American citizenship or his claims of ignorance would somehow protect him from serious consequences. The evidence shows a pattern of escalating disrespectful behavior that culminated in the physical assault of a serving soldier. Magistrate Pemberton continued, your own recorded statements demonstrate that this was not a momentary lapse of judgment, but a deliberate campaign of harassment designed to humiliate a professional military officer for your own entertainment. Jake's hands trembled as he gripped the rail of the dock. His solicitor placed a supportive hand on his shoulder, but even she seemed resigned to the inevitable harsh sentence. Furthermore, the magistrate added, your complete lack of remorse throughout these proceedings, your attempts to minimize your actions, and your continued insistence that your behavior was somehow justified demonstrate that you pose a continuing risk to public order and the dignity of our institutions. The courtroom was so quiet that Jake could hear his own heart beating. The reality that he was about to be sentenced to prison in a foreign country was finally penetrating his consciousness. On the charge of assault on a member of Her Majesty's forces, I sentence you to 4 months imprisonment. On the charge of disorderly conduct, 2 months imprisonment to run concurrently. On the charge of attempted bribery of a police officer, 1 month imprisonment to run concurrently. Jake's legs nearly gave out beneath him. 4 months in a British prison. His vacation was supposed to last 2 weeks, and now he would be locked up for 16 weeks. His job back in Texas, his apartment, his entire life would be in ruins by the time he was released. Additionally, Magistrate Pemberton continued, you are banned from returning to the United Kingdom for a period of 5 years following your release. Any attempt to re-enter Britain during this period will result in immediate arrest and further criminal charges. The 5-year ban was perhaps even more devastating than the prison sentence. Jake had planned to return to Europe for his honeymoon next year with his girlfriend Sarah. Now she would learn about his arrest through social media, along with everyone else he knew. As the court officers moved to escort Jake from the dock, he finally broke down completely. "Please, Your Honor. I'm sorry, I didn't mean for any of this to happen. Can't you give me another chance?" The tears that had been building since his arrest finally flowed freely, but Magistrate Pemberton was unmoved. "Mr. Morrison, you had numerous chances to show remorse and take responsibility for your actions. You chose instead to maintain your innocence despite overwhelming evidence and to show continued disrespect for this court and our institutions." As Jake was led away in handcuffs, the public gallery buzzed with conversation. Several British veterans who had attended the hearing expressed satisfaction that justice had been served. One elderly man who had served in the same regiment as Guardsman Chen spoke to a reporter outside the courthouse. "That young American learned a hard lesson today," he said with grim satisfaction. "Our guards represent the very best of British military tradition. They deserve respect, not harassment, from ignorant tourists who think everything is entertainment." Meanwhile, back at Buckingham Palace, Guardsman William Chen was informed of the court's verdict during his off-duty hours. He felt no joy in Jake's punishment, but he was satisfied that the system had worked as intended. The incident had reinforced his pride in wearing the uniform and serving his country. The news of Jake's sentence spread rapidly across social media, where his original video had already garnered millions of views. The comments section was filled with a mixture of mockery for Jake's stupidity and support for the British justice system's handling of the case. Jake's girlfriend Sarah back in Texas learned about her boyfriend's arrest through a Facebook post shared by one of their mutual friends. The embarrassing video of his behavior and subsequent arrest played automatically on her timeline, showing her a side of Jake she had never seen before. By the time she finished watching, she had already made the decision to end their relationship. His employer, a Dallas-based construction company, saw the viral video within hours of Jake's sentencing. The company's owner immediately posted a statement on their website, distancing the business from Jake's actions and announcing his termination effective immediately. No company wanted to be associated with someone who had become internationally famous for disrespecting military personnel. As Jake began his first night in Pentonville prison, he lay on his narrow cell bunk contemplating the ruins of his life. His social media fame had come at the cost of everything he had worked for. His job, his relationship, his reputation, and his freedom had all been sacrificed for a few minutes of viral video content. The other prisoners initially found his story amusing, but their laughter only deepened Jake's shame and regret. He had become exactly what he had always mocked, a cautionary tale about the consequences of arrogance and disrespect. Months later, when Jake was finally released and deported back to the United States, he found that his notoriety had followed him home. Job applications were rejected once potential employers discovered his criminal record. Dating became impossible as his arrest video was still easily found online. Jake Morrison had sought fame and attention, and he had certainly achieved it. But the lesson he learned was far different from what he had intended. He discovered that respect is not something that can be demanded or ignored without consequences, and that the traditions and institutions of other nations deserve the same reverence that he would expect for his own country's symbols of service and sacrifice.